In her lifetime, she was dismissed by many of her male contemporaries. She died in poverty in 1960 and was buried in an unmarked grave. Her masterpiece, Their Eyes Were Watching God, sold fewer than 5,000 copies while she was alive. Today, 500,000 copies of her books are sold each year. Her ardent fans include writers Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and rapper Cardi B. This morning, I sit down with Texas Women's University professor Dr. Genevieve West. She has a new book out, You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Essays. This book is about the novelist, anthropologist, maid, manicurist, voodoo apprentice, and trailblazer, Zora Neale Hurston. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Good morning and welcome so much, Dr. West, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, congratulations on your book. And I know this book was written with a preeminent scholar, a Harvard scholar, Dr. Henry Louis Gates. So first, I just want to ask you, I'm a big fan of Dr. Gates. What was it like to work on a book with him?
You know, it's really kind of amazing. He knows so much about so many things that working with him is always a pleasure.
Wow, that's fantastic. And so what was the impetus for, collecting all of these amazing essays from Zora and putting them in this one collection?
You know, this volume has been in the making for Dr. Gates and I for about a decade. As we kind of started to collect the things that are in the volume, but also other things. We have spent a lot of time looking for everything that we could find by Zora, including things that had never been published in her lifetime. And, a volume like this is way overdue for somebody of Hurston's stature. We have access to essays by other major figures in American literature, but have not always had access to Hurston's essays. And some of the most interesting things are things that were not printed in her lifetime or were very difficult to get. Some years ago, I cited an essay that appeared in a small Black periodical in the early 30s, and actually had other scholars reach out to me because they couldn't get it. They couldn't get their hands on it. And so, it was way overdue, right? To make this available, not just for scholars, but also for Hurston's average readers. She has this legion of fans out there who love her work. And to make them available, I think is really important for Hurston's long-term viability as a major figure in American literature.
Yes, she does have this very wide swath of fans. I mentioned some of them in the opening, from preeminent writers to singers to rappers, everyday readers, my daughters included, love, so many of her books. We've all had an opportunity, many of us have had an opportunity to get to know her, but I think it's important to give those folks that maybe aren't as familiar with her, give us a little, snippet of who Zora Neale Hurston was. I had an opportunity to see a one-woman play that was performed by Vanessa Bell Calloway on Zora, and it was so riveting, just the most amazing play, and it just chronicled her life. So I got to learn about her watching the stage play, but also I've read so much about her. But for those who maybe are new to Zora, tell us kind of in a nutshell who she was.
Well, between 1920 and 1960, Hurston was the most prolific Black woman writer in America. And I think, given our own time, it's difficult for us to imagine what the challenges were for her at the time. But just finishing high school at the time was considered quite the accomplishment. And she she was born in 1868. I'm sorry, I can't get my dates right. 1891 in Notasulga, Alabama. Grew up in Florida, and then kind of went on the road with a Gilbert and Sullivan troupe, and would finish high school in Baltimore, attend Howard University for a couple of years, but then she was having trouble making ends meet and paying tuition because she'd been on her own for a really long time at that point. And she moved to New York, to Harlem. And it was like the early days of the Harlem Renaissance. And she landed right in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance and really flourished. And that was really the beginning of Hurston as we know her as a major writer.
Yeah, and some of those facts I find interesting. Unlike many African Americans born in that period, she started out in a family that was pretty middle class until her mom died. I guess she was a young girl, 9, 10 or so when her mom died. And then it was her father who kind of, I guess, remarried, and circumstances changed, which led her to leave home. And I know I've read that she changed her age. She set her age back 10 years so that she could go back to high school.
Yes.
Finish high school because she hadn't finished school when she left home and went on her adventures, with that troupe that you just mentioned. And so for many years, we didn't know what her real birthday was because, there are lots of accounts of when she was actually born. But you're right, it's in the late 1800s. Talk about her as major of a figure as she was, and you put her in the context of being in Harlem in the 30s and 40s as Harlem is experiencing this renaissance. She didn't always, though, fit in. She was quite controversial, particularly her and her male contemporaries often clashed. So talk some about that. Why was she considered so controversial?
We tend to think of the Harlem Renaissance as this kind of monolith, right? As this kind of moment. But there were lots of different ideas about what Black art could be and what it should be and what it should be doing and what Black writers should be doing at the time. And so the really powerful kind of older figures, people like Alain Locke, who had been a professor of Hurston's at Howard, and W.E.B. Du Bois, they had more conservative ideas about art. And the quote, younger writers, people like Langston Hughes and Hurston and Wallace Thurman, they were not on the same page as their elders. And in some ways, it's interesting to me because Hurston, in terms of chronological age, was probably closer to the age of Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois, but she was coming of age as a writer with these other younger writers at the time. And there was this perception that Black art would be able to bridge the gap between the races, between Black and white readers, and that it would be able to break down stereotypes and break down walls for African Americans. And the younger writers really kind of rejected the notion that that's what art should be doing, that it should be propagandistic, that it should, only depict the best sides of the race. And so she wrote about characters that others didn't think should necessarily be depicted in literature. So her Florida characters, they're folk characters, right? They speak in the language of the folk. They engage in hunting, and they play cards, and they play dice, and they sing, and they tell stories, where other writers of the period, and particularly other women who are often connected with her, people like Nella Larson and Jessie Fawcett, were writing about very upper middle class characters, women who went to college and, had very conservative notions of Black female identity. And Hurston rejected those. She felt like the people that she had grown up among in the rural South were just as worthy of artistic depiction as people who had gone to college like she had. And so there's an intersectionality at work here. So it's not just about race, it's also about class. Mm-hmm. And I think those class tensions are really, really important when we think about some of the early controversies regarding Hurston and her art, as it was about class.
Mhm. And I know there was a huge dispute that she and Langston Hughes had over a play and who was the original creator and writer of this play. Is how does that focus? How does that get centered in the collection of essays that are in your book?
It really doesn't surface a great deal. You can find information about Mulebone, and that was the play that they had the falling out about. You can find more really about Mulebone in her collected letters, which Carla Kaplan did some years ago. But the essays themselves are really more about her artistic philosophy. And in that way, they probably inform some of the dispute that she was having with Langston Hughes, because she was really interested in what she would call an authentic depiction of folk art. Even with music, you see her criticize like the way that spirituals are being performed around the country and even in Europe, that that's not the way that they are performed in churches or in communities, that what you're seeing is a kind of, well, it's been dressed up, she would say, to be performed in a way that's not necessarily authentic. And so she was really interested in authenticity. And I think that in some ways that might have been at the root of what happened with her and Langston Hughes. There was also another person involved who was doing the transcription, Louise Thompson, who was typing for them. And at one point, Langston wanted to add her as a co-author. And I think Hurston kind of got frustrated with it and tried to pull out of the collaboration without necessarily telling that to Langston Hughes.
So we know, Professor West, that Zora, despite how prolific a writer that she was during this period, ends up pretty much destitute. She died in poverty. She's buried in a grave that doesn't even have a marker. It's Alice Walker, who some years later goes, many years later after her death, and gives her a marker. How was it that someone as talented and as prolific as Zora would end up in that financial situation?
Her books never sold in the way that like a bestseller would. So it's not that she made a lot of money off of the books. In the 40s, she was making a living largely off of essays that she was selling to popular periodicals. And we find those collected in the volume. But by the 50s, Hurston had been through a really difficult accusation of child molestation in New York. And it happened just as her final novel was coming out. And it left her in debt, unfortunately, because she had to defend herself in court, and left her with legal fees. And I think she was really traumatized, frankly, by what happened to her. And she retreated to Florida, and she worked as a maid, cleaning someone else's home for a while, because of the emotional trauma and the exhaustion. As a creative person, you have to have, Virginia Woolf would have said a room of your own. But for Hurston, it was more basic. It was a roof over her head and food to eat, because she was responsible for supporting herself. And so without those kinds of very basic survival level needs being met, there's no way she could write. She worked as a librarian for some time, but then her health deteriorated. And by the time she died in 1960, she was probably, we would say, obese, definitely overweight and suffering from hypertension. And she had a stroke, and she ended up in a nursing home.
So I know in the book you and Professor Gates organized these essays in, you group them in by topics, politics, race, gender, folkloric studies. Why those categories?
Because, well, there are a couple of different reasons. it allows a reader who's interested in kind of exploring a subject. So if you're interested in anthropology, you can go to the folkloric work, or maybe you're interested in, what was Hurston saying about gender in the 30s? It kind of gives you a place to start. And I suspect that a lot of readers will come at the volume that way. It is a big volume, right? And so I won't be surprised at all to learn that people are kind of sampling a little bit here and sampling a little bit there. And because so many people know her, it gives them a way to come into this very large volume. There is a chronological table of contents at the back, which gives readers an alternate way to read and kind of see Hurston's aesthetics evolve over time. So we wanted to provide readers with both ways into the book, and it just kind of depends on what you need as a reader and what you're looking for as a reader.
So we know she wore lots of hats. You talked about her working as a maid to support herself. We know she, kind of dibbled and dabbled in voodoo. She's called a voodoo apprentice. We know she was an anthropologist. How do all of those hats that she wore, all of those, things that really made her the woman that she was, how do they get infused in the essays and her writings?
It's really easy to see, like in the folkloric section. Obviously, she's turning her training as an anthropologist on folklore, so that you get that lens very clearly. But it also, that training in folklore made her, and anthropology made her a great student, an observant, right, of other people's behaviors. And she was a great watcher. And so you see her perspective kind of recorded in these essays where she's talking about, the ways that people behave and the things that they say. And sometimes there are contradictions between what people say and what they actually do. And so even in something like The Lost Keys of Glory, which is an essay that is published here for the first time, it's an essay that is framed by a folktale. So it begins with a folktale and it ends with a folktale. But in between is a more expository essay that talks about gender dynamics in the 40s.
So help us understand, too, the evolution of Zora Neale Hurston. Like many writers and many artists, their work evolves as they grow, as they mature, as they have more experiences. What happened to her over, the arc of her life? What kind of changes did you see in was it, in terms of the topics that she wrote about or the way that she wrote about those topics? What are some of the biggest changes that you saw?
I think for me, the big change, and it's manifested in the essays, is that she starts her career being very unconcerned about the white gaze and wanting to write about Black experience for Black readers and not worry about what white people might think about it. But by the end of her career, she had come to understand that, unfortunately, it was being misread. A lot of her work had been misread as confirming racist stereotypes. And so particularly in the essays, you can see her becoming more and more direct in her confrontations about race and about gender, and it does change. It's in her fiction, it often is very subtle even and subversive, but the essays become more direct and more confrontational as she realizes that people have misread her as a person and they've misread her fiction.
So when you say she believed that she was misread, they believed that because she wrote about what she considered to be the authentic life and lifestyle of African Americans, that she was somehow playing into racist tropes and racist stereotypes that were pretty pervasive during her life in the 30s and 40s?
Absolutely. And I'll point to Richard Wright because he's such a great example. If you're a student of American literature, you know his Native Son and Black Boy. These were major works of fiction, and he was a contemporary of Hurston's. But when Their Eyes Were Watching God came out, he actually accused her of minstrelsy in his review of Their Eyes Were Watching God. God. And his review was part of my entree into Hurston studies, because I had read Alice Walker saying there was no book more important to her than Their Eyes Were Watching God. And then I came across Richard Wright's review where he described it as minstrelsy, and trying to make sense of those two perspectives on Hurston's novel, which we consider her masterpiece, and I think is a fabulous, beautiful, insightful, really complex work of fiction, he reduced to minstrelsy. And so trying to grapple with that, that's part of what he was seeing. To go back to your question about stereotypes, is he was seeing minstrelsy in her folk characters. And so you see Hurston become more vocal in her nonfiction in defending what she does and why she does it, and attacking what she sees as misrepresentations of Black folks.
And was that attack by Richard Wright, was that a pretty common attack? Particularly, I've read that, again, she had this conflict with many of the male writers during this period. So would you say that Richard Wright's critique of her was, represented how many of her male contemporaries thought about her writings, or was that kind of an isolated review or critique?
It increases in volume. So with her first novel in 1934, there are some questions. When Mules and Men, which was her second book, came out in 1935, it was a collection of folklore. But people who admitted that they had never read the collection took offense at the title, that she was equating African Americans to mules. Mm-hmm. And so that created some controversy. And then we see with the third book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, the chorus becomes a little bit louder. And by this point, Richard Wright is emerging as a major figure in American literature. Ralph Ellison said that Hurston had contributed nothing to American literature. And Wright and Locke and Ellison were three of the big voices still in the 30s and 40s. And so it's difficult to break it down along gender lines and say that this was a common perception, but it certainly was a perception among the more powerful and prominent figures, for sure.
And your analysis of it, you said it wouldn't be fair to say that these attacks were, gender-based, so there wasn't a bias because she was a female. That doesn't hold true in terms of the analysis of what that dispute was about. You think it was more race than gender?
I think it's race and class, but less gender, at least for those three critics.
And so in the book, You Don't Know Negroes and Other Essays, you also, you and Professor Gates tell the story of Ruby McCullum. Why was it important to tell that story? This is a wealthy Black woman who's convicted of killing a white doctor who she was having an affair with.
Yeah, it's a really compelling read, and it had never been reproduced anywhere. But it's a series of articles that Hurston wrote about Ruby, and it really gives you a look at the judicial system. So at a time when we are more aware than we have been in some time as a nation about the lack of equity in the judicial system and levels of incarceration for Black men and things like this. To read what Ruby endured gives you some history for that, because while there were Black men called to be part of her jury, they were part of the jury pool, they were all ultimately excused, which was probably in their best interest, certainly, in that particular community. So she was tried by an all-white, all-male jury. The judge was white, the attorneys were white, and she had a very difficult time telling her story in court. In fact, most of her story never came out in court.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that touched Zora so? Was it, again, just her interest in the judicial system, her interest in, the dynamics between whites and Blacks during that period?
I think that that's part of it, yes. But I think that there's also something about gender at work here. And again, class, because Ruby was very wealthy, but her husband's money came from illegal gambling activities. And there's some speculation that the judge didn't want her story to come out in court because it would implicate other powerful white men in town, because clearly Ruby's husband would not have been able to maintain his activities without their tacit support and with paying bribes, frankly. And I think Hurston, she's pretty clear about the fact that she went into the trial and she actually met with the judge, and she believed that Ruby would get a fair trial, and watched that perception crumble in the courtroom, and was really, I think, quite devastated to find that they were very actively silencing Ruby.
Yeah. Why, despite the critique of her best, the book that people probably know the most, why do you think that book has resonated with so many people?
You know, I think for a lot of people, it's a story about a woman who's trying to figure out how to have a relationship with a man and not lose herself in that relationship. And so, you know, her first husband, her grandmother says, well, you marry for security. He has the only organ in town, right? And it's certainly not about love or attraction or even companionship. And she walks away from the second marriage, and she marries the second, or walks away from the first marriage, and she marries the second time to somebody who speaks of a different life, and a life beyond what she has known. And there seems to be, at least early on, some level of companionship and romance and attraction there. And then by the third one, after the second husband dies, she meets a man who is not of her social class, but who makes her happy. And they build a relationship together. It's in that third relationship that she learns to tell stories for the first time, that she learns to play checkers, that she learns to shoot a gun. And so we see her identity grow and develop over the course of her life. And so I think that her continuing growth and development over the course of a long life is part of what people find attractive, and what resonates is we do grow and change over time. Life doesn't stop changing us because we've gotten married at 21 or 25 or 30. We continue to grow and change and evolve. And you know, Tea Cake has his issues, right? He does hit Janie, and I don't want to ignore that by any stretch of the imagination, but it's by far the healthiest relationship that we see her engage in, and she's still very much in love with him at the end of the book.
Yeah, and so their eyes, again, we're talking about their eyes were watching God, the most popular novel, and the novel that most people know that Zora Neale Hurston wrote. It was so poorly received, you know, when it was written. And again, do you think that was a gender issue? Because now it's like the most influential book in literature. Kids have to read it in high school. It's hard to find someone that hasn't read it, or at least doesn't know about the book. And I just wonder, was that because of, you know, the gender dynamics that existed in the early 20th century?
I think it's partly that, but I think it also has to do with the way the book was marketed. Female reviewers responded much more positively to the novel than male reviewers did. And it's also the 30s. So by 1937, we're really at the depths of the Great Depression. And American fiction had begun to move in the direction of protest, moving towards Grapes of Wrath, moving towards Black Boy and Native Son. So American fiction was moving in a more confrontational, class-oriented direction, and they marketed the book as a romance.
As a love story. So just
as a love story.
Yeah.
And so
like 2005, Time then identified it as one of the, 100 on its kind of top 100 best literature books, or books in literature in, gets that prominent recognition so many years later after it's written. And I guess that happens to a lot of work by writers, is that it's after they die that people take, really grow an interest and start to appreciate how significant their body of work is. What do you want people to take away from this collection that you and Professor Gates have worked 10 years on, which is incredible?
Yeah.
Know Us Negroes, such a great title. And what do you want folks to take away from it?
I hope that people come away with a better understanding of just how complicated an individual Hurston was, how insightful, how perceptive. That title essay, You Don't Know Us Negroes, she wrote it in 1934, and it never appeared. And I think had it appeared, it might have changed the reception of her work in her lifetime. And so recovering that and making it available for critics, I think is really crucial to her reputation over time. But I think there's so much in this collection that gives you a sense of what life was like for people in the 30s and the 40s. The endnotes, oh my gosh, the endnotes. We spent a lot of time annotating this volume because there's so much context that we don't have today. She talks about in one essay the 4 freedoms, and people today don't know what the 4 freedoms are. And so we annotated it to try to make it more accessible. And I just hope that people come away with a richer, deeper appreciation of Hurston as a person and as a writer.
And is that why you all chose that essay, You Don't Know Us Negroes, as the title for the collection? Is because you thought that would help really change people's mindset, or what they may have, read about her, or opinions they may have had based on what they've read?
I think it is the most important of the unpublished works that we found by far.
Just curious, how did you all find these unpublished works? Are they, held by family members, or are they in a museum? Where are they?
A lot of them are in libraries around the country. And so, there are things at the Library of Congress. There are things, the Lost Keys of Glory were at Columbia, right? So Hurston might have, like she did with the Lost Keys of Glory, she sent it to Helen Erskine Caldwell. And when Caldwell's papers were donated to Columbia, Hurston's essay was in that donation, right? And the same thing with the Library of Congress piece. It was donated in the papers of Jane Bellow. And so, today we have multiple versions of things, like things live on computers and hard drives. And, this was the era of typewriters and carbons. And we know that Hurston lost a lot of work at one point. She shuttled back and forth between New York and Florida. And on one of her trips south, her steamer trunk, which was what people traveled with at the time, disappeared. And so she got to Jacksonville and she got off and her trunk was gone. Mm-hmm. And, it was full of things that we probably have never seen.
So you all had to comb these libraries and Columbia colleges to find these original pieces, because I thought you were saying that these pieces were published in books at the libraries, but no, they're just original paper typed essays that you were able to find through this exhaustive search, I guess, that you and Professor Gates were on.
Searching databases and library holdings is how we found things. Backtracking through other scholars' work, trying to find references. Did we miss something? And it's entirely possible that there are things that we missed that are uncatalogued.
You feel like you found everything, obviously not the missing trunk that that's still presumably missing. But I mean, I imagine this is the most comprehensive collection of unpublished and published essays.
Yes, it is by far the most comprehensive collection of Hurston's nonfiction. I really hope, actually, that there's stuff out there that we didn't find, right? That there's, a lot of libraries, they get these donations and it takes years to go through the boxes and catalog and see what's in the various folders. And so I still have hope that we may still yet uncover, not essays even, but also like novels or other things. Hurston worked on novels at the end of her life that we no longer have copies of. And so, where are those? Maybe they still exist somewhere. I'm hopeful.
So there may be a volume 2 or edition 2 of You Don't Know Us Negroes.
I would love that.
That's exciting. As you said, there may be things out there still to be uncovered. Thank you so much, Professor West, for sitting down with me and helping us have a better understanding of Zora. I am definitely one of those fangirls. I love her work. I love that we are getting to see her through fresh eyes, a different perspective. I think, and I know this isn't all gender-based, but in my brain, everything I've read just seemed like she was, in some ways, under attack. Like, she was in this Harlem Renaissance, and here she is, so prolific, so talented, but sometimes it seemed like she was under attack, or just her life was in turmoil. So much of it was distressing for me to learn about that.
It is distressing to know that she died in poverty, and they took up donations to bury her in an unmarked grave in a segregated cemetery. That's heartbreaking, right? It's really devastating. But I like to think that somewhere Zora is having a good time and loving the fact that we have found her work and that we appreciate her work. There are volumes of plays that most people don't know about. There are volumes of short stories. So there is a whole body of work out there. And if people have just read Their Eyes Were Watching God, then there's so much more to read.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way to get into this reading and to learn more about Zora Neale Hurston, obviously, is to pick up a copy of this amazing book, You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Essays. I love the title of that essay, and I hope everyone picks it up. And I love how it's organized, so you can find those things that resonate with you, things that may be of particular interest, and you can work your way slowly through the entire volume. But thank you so much again for your work, for doing this, because it's so incredibly important, particularly in this moment where we're having this discussion about race and this national conversation that we've been having. I think having her voice play a part in it is so incredibly important.
Yeah, we're not talking about anything new.
Yeah.
Hurston makes it clear these conversations have been going on a long time.
Yeah, and she was a vocal, such a big voice on these issues in the 30s and 40s, and it's really interesting to see, as you said, how the conversations are so incredibly similar. I mean, it's almost like the same conversations that we've been having in this country for decades. Women like Zora Neale Hurston was leading those conversations decades ago. So again, thank you, Dr. West, for sitting down with me.
Well, thank you for having me, Areva. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank Professor West for sitting down with me. If you don't know Zora Neale Hurston, you need to get to know her. If you were lucky, you read her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, while in high school. Maybe you read it in college. Maybe someone gave it to you as a gift. But there is so much more, as Professor West told us, to Zora Neale Hurston. She's written plays, she's written fiction, she's written nonfiction, so many incredible essays. And this book, You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Essays, gives you an opportunity to learn about Zora Neale Hurston, what she was thinking about politics, what she was thinking about gender issues, about class issues, about so many issues that we're talking about today. And as Professor West said, these aren't new issues, these aren't new topics, these aren't new discussions. These were similar conversations and discussions that were happening all over this country, particularly in Harlem during that period called the Harlem Renaissance. Frankly, I think Zora was targeted by many of the male writers during that period, the male artists. I don't think she was given her proper respect. I'm just so happy that she's finally getting the respect because she so deserves. So make sure you pick up the book, You Don't Know Us, Negroes and Other Essays. It's going to change your life. And Words to Live By is one of my famous quotes from Zora Neale Hurston. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. Think about that. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.